Somewhere in Africa, roughly 300,000 years ago, two people met. We do not know their names. We do not know the specific landscape where the encounter happened, whether it was on an open savanna, in a forest clearing, near a water source that both their groups had independently been drawn to. We do not know what the meeting looked like from the outside, whether it was cautious, whether there was tension, whether it began with the wariness that encounters between unfamiliar groups in the ancient world typically carried. What we know is that the encounter produced offspring, and those offspring had offspring, and those offspring had offspring, and that chain, unbroken, continuous, thread-thin in some generations and wider in others, surviving ice ages and droughts and predators and disease and every catastrophe the ancient world could produce, eventually produced every single one of the approximately 8 billion human beings alive on Earth today. Every person on this planet, every human being in every country, speaking every language, living in every culture, across every continent that humans have reached, all of them are the descendants of that meeting. And not just that meeting, of a specific, surprisingly small number of ancient humans whose reproductive success was sufficient to thread a continuous genetic lineage through hundreds of thousands of years of brutal selection pressure to reach the present. This is the story of how 8 billion people came from so few, and the mathematics of it, the genetics of it, the specific population events that shaped the lineage connecting ancient Africa to the modern world are genuinely extraordinary and almost entirely unknown to most people who have ever thought about it. Let's start with a number that will recalibrate everything that follows. At various points in ancient human history, the population of our species was so small that modern geneticists, analyzing the diversity patterns in our current genomes, can detect the signature of those bottlenecks in the genetic data we carry right now. The most significant of these appears to have occurred somewhere between 900,000 and 800,000 years ago, not in Homo sapiens because our species did not yet exist, but in an ancestral population that eventually gave rise to us. A study published in Science in 2023 used a new analytical method called fast infinitesimal time coalescent process, FITCOL. Because scientists apparently enjoy acronyms almost as much as they enjoy making headlines, to analyze the genomes of modern humans from across the world and reconstruct the demographic history of ancient human ancestors. What it found was remarkable. For a period of approximately 117,000 years, the ancestral population of modern humans appears to have been reduced to somewhere between 1,000 and 1,280 breeding individuals. Not 1,000 total people. 1,280 breeding individuals, adults capable of reproduction. The total population, including children and non-reproductive adults, would have been somewhat larger, but still extraordinarily small by any measure. For context, 1,280 breeding individuals is smaller than the current population of many apartment buildings. It is the kind of number that population geneticists associate with imminent extinction risk in endangered species. This population survived for 100 to 17,000 years, through conditions extreme enough to reduce the entire ancestral human lineage to this remnant. And every person alive today is descended from that remnant, from the specific individuals whose lineages threaded through that 117,000-year crucible and came out the other side. That is the foundation on which 8 billion people eventually built. Let's talk about what that bottleneck means genetically, because the genetic consequences of that near-extinction event are still present in the modern human genome and still shaping human biology today. A population of 1,280 breeding individuals carries a limited amount of genetic diversity. When a population that was previously much larger is reduced to a small number of survivors, it loses genetic variants that were present in the larger population. The survivors carry only a sample of the original diversity, and that sample, however small, becomes the genetic foundation for all subsequent generations. This is called the founder effect when it applies to a small group founding a new population in a new location, and a population bottleneck when it applies to a catastrophic reduction of an existing population. In both cases, the genetic consequence is the same: reduced diversity in the surviving population and increased prevalence of whatever genetic variants happened to be present in the survivors. The modern human genome shows the fingerprints of this ancient bottleneck in multiple ways. Our species is remarkably genetically similar compared to what you would expect from 300,000 years of existence. Two random humans from anywhere on Earth are more genetically similar to each other than two randomly selected chimpanzees from the same forest. This is not because modern humans have had less time to diverge. Chimps and bonobos are younger species than we are in terms of when they branched from a common ancestor. It is because our ancestral population was so severely reduced that a large portion of the genetic diversity that existed before the bottleneck was lost. The genetic diversity that survived that bottleneck, the variants present in those 1,280 breeding individuals, is the genetic raw material from which all subsequent human variation was built. The diversity we see in modern human populations, which feels substantial and is significant in many ways, is actually a subset of what existed before the bottleneck. We are a species that almost wasn't. Now let's talk about the specific ancient population event that most directly shaped the ancestral lineage of all modern humans: the out-of-Africa dispersal, because this is where the story gets most directly relevant to the question of how we got from a small ancient population to 8 billion people. Modern Homo sapiens evolved in Africa. This is well established and not seriously contested in the scientific literature. The oldest anatomically modern human fossils, from sites including Jebel Irhoud in Morocco dating to approximately 315,000 years ago, and Omo Kibish in Ethiopia dating to approximately 233,000 years ago, are all African. The genetic diversity of African populations is greater than that of any other continental population, consistent with Africa being the source population from which all others are derived. Populations that have been in place longer have had more time to accumulate genetic variation. At some point, most likely between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, based on the convergence of archaeological and genetic evidence, a population of modern humans left Africa. Not a large migration of thousands of people. A small group, genetic estimates typically place the founding population of the out-of-Africa dispersal at somewhere in the range of a few hundred to a few thousand individuals, who crossed out of Africa, possibly through the Horn of Africa and across what is now the southern end of the Red Sea, into the Arabian Peninsula, and then beyond. This founding group, this small, specific population of ancient humans who crossed out of Africa, are the ancestors of every non-African person alive today. Every person of European descent, East Asian descent, South Asian descent, Indigenous American descent, Pacific Islander descent, Australian Aboriginal descent, all of them trace their non-African ancestry to this specific small group of ancient people who made this specific crossing at some point roughly 60,000 years ago. The genetic evidence for this is unambiguous. Non-African populations share specific genetic variants, including the Neanderthal and Denisovan admixture that occurred after the out-of-Africa crossing, that are not present in the same proportions in African populations. The genetic diversity of non-African populations is a subset of African diversity, consistent with a founding event that captured only a fraction of the diversity present in the source population. The non-African human genome is, in a precise genetic sense, a compressed version of African human genetic diversity, a sample drawn from the larger African genetic pool by the specific ancient people who made the crossing. Let's talk about those Neanderthal and Denisovan encounters, because they represent exactly the kind of ancient meeting that the title of this video is about. Specific encounters between specific groups of ancient humans that permanently altered the genetic legacy of everyone descended from them. After the out-of-Africa dispersal, the ancestors of modern non-Africans encountered Neanderthals. This is established by the presence of Neanderthal DNA, typically 1 to 4%, in the genomes of all living non-African people. The interbreeding event, or more likely multiple interbreeding events, happened somewhere in the Middle East or Western Asia, probably within the first few thousand years after the out-of-Africa crossing. The Neanderthal DNA that entered the modern human gene pool at that point has been carried forward, generation after generation, for roughly 60,000 years, and it is still there in your genome right now if you have non-African ancestry. The Denisovan contribution is even more dramatic in specific populations. People from Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, and surrounding islands carry approximately 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA, the highest proportion of archaic human admixture found in any modern population. This Denisovan DNA entered the ancestral Melanesian lineage through specific interbreeding encounters in Southeast Asia or the Pacific region at some point after the out-of-Africa dispersal and before the ancestors of modern Melanesians reached their current locations. What this means is that the genomes of modern humans are not purely Homo sapiens. They are mosaics, primarily Homo sapiens, but carrying specific genetic contributions from at least two other ancient human species that are now extinct as distinct populations. The specific encounters between our ancestors and these other human groups. Encounters that probably involved small numbers of individuals, possibly in contexts of extended intergroup contact rather than single dramatic meetings, permanently altered the genetic character of the lineages that carried their mixed genetic heritage forward. Some of the Neanderthal and Denisovan genetic variants that were incorporated into modern human genomes have been positively selected for, meaning they provided genuine survival advantages in specific environments. The Tibetan high-altitude adaptation derived from Denisovan EPAS1 variants is one example. Several immune system variants of Neanderthal origin have been identified as beneficial in specific disease contexts. The ancient encounters that produced this admixture were not genetically neutral events. They introduced specific functional variants that shaped the survival capacities of the lineages that carried them forward, contributing to the eventual success of those lineages in specific environments. Let's talk about population growth mathematics, because the journey from a few thousand ancient humans to 8 billion is a story that requires some numerical scaffolding to make sense. The transition from a founding population of a few thousand to the current global population did not happen at a constant rate. For most of ancient human history, population growth was slow, variable, and repeatedly interrupted by catastrophic reductions. The human population remained small, probably in the low millions globally even as recently as 70,000 years ago, and fluctuated in response to climate events, resource availability, and the other variables that constrained ancient population size. The first major acceleration came with the global expansion of modern humans out of Africa and into previously unoccupied territories. As modern humans moved into Europe, Asia, the Americas, and eventually Australia and the Pacific Islands, they were entering landscapes without any previous modern human population. Landscapes that, from the perspective of modern human subsistence strategies, were essentially empty. The population carrying capacity of these new territories was available to be filled, and modern human populations expanded to fill it. The second and dramatically more significant acceleration came with the transition to agriculture, beginning approximately 12,000 years ago. Agriculture allowed the support of vastly larger populations per unit of land area than hunting and gathering could sustain, and the adoption of farming across the world produced a population growth trajectory that transformed the human demographic situation within a few thousand years. From perhaps 5 to 10 million people globally at the beginning of the agricultural transition, the human population grew to hundreds of millions within a few thousand years, and eventually to billions within a few thousand more. The agricultural transition is, in demographic terms, the single event most responsible for the gap between the ancient founding populations and the 8 billion people alive today. Without it, the upper limit of human population in a fully hunter-gatherer world would probably be somewhere in the range of 10 to 50 million people globally. The 8 billion figure is not the outcome of ancient human success in isolation. It is the outcome of ancient human success followed by the agricultural revolution that ancient humans eventually invented. But let's go back to the ancient period and think about what the specific population dynamics actually looked like from the inside. Because the abstract genetics and demographics do not capture the human reality of how small those founding groups actually were. The population of all modern humans' non-African ancestors at the moment of the out of Africa crossing approximately 60,000 years ago was probably a few thousand individuals at most. These were people organized into small bands of 15 to 30 individuals moving through the landscape on the far side of the Red Sea crossing in an environment that was neither hostile nor friendly, but simply new. A landscape without any previous modern human occupation, but with its own predators, its own diseases, its own resource distribution. Within that founding population, those few thousand people, there was a specific subset whose lineages actually survived to produce descendants who are alive today. Not all of them made it. Ancient life imposed continuous selective pressure, and many lineages that existed in that founding population ended without reaching the present. The specific individuals whose genetic material is present in modern non-African genomes were the ones whose lineages threaded successfully through 60,000 years of subsequent history, surviving climate fluctuations, population crashes, disease outbreaks, conflicts, and the accumulated mortality of the ancient world. Who were these people? We can say some things about them from the genetics. They were genetically diverse enough to provide the founding variation from which all subsequent non-African genetic diversity developed. They were physiologically and behaviorally capable of surviving in environments ranging from the Arabian Peninsula to the Arctic. The eventual range of their descendants suggests a founding population with the adaptive flexibility to colonize a remarkable diversity of ecological conditions. They were socially organized and culturally sophisticated enough to maintain viable populations across thousands of years of movement and adaptation. Beyond that, they were specific people. Individuals with names that no one ever recorded, living lives of specific detail and complexity that we cannot reconstruct, doing the ordinary and extraordinary things that ancient human life required, and the reproductive decisions those specific people made, who they partnered with, how many children they had, where they moved, shaped in specific ways the genetic character of the populations that eventually descended from them. There is a concept in genetics called the most recent common ancestor, the single individual who is the most recent common ancestor of every living member of a defined population. For all living humans, this ancestor existed surprisingly recently. Mathematical modeling suggests that the most recent common ancestor of all living humans probably lived within the past few thousand years, possibly as recently as 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, because the growing human population and increasing inter-regional contact eventually connected all human lineages through a common recent ancestor. But if you are asking about the most recent common ancestors of specific founding lineages, the specific ancient individuals whose genetic contributions reached every corner of the world's non-African populations, you are looking at the specific small group who made the out-of-Africa crossing. Every non-African person alive today shares ancestry with every person in that crossing group, because the expansion of their descendants eventually covered every continent outside Africa and, through back migration, contributed to African populations as well. The mathematics of ancestry expansion make this less counterintuitive than it initially seems. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. The number of your ancestors doubles with every generation. Go back 60 generations, roughly 1,500 years, and your theoretical number of ancestors exceeds the total human population of that time. This means that beyond a certain point in the past, every person who left living descendants is an ancestor of every person alive today, because the genealogical network has become so interconnected that no one can escape having descended from everyone who was reproductively successful in that era. Now apply this logic to 60,000 years of human population history, and the implication is striking. The specific individuals who were reproductively successful in the ancient founding populations of modern human lineages are the ancestors of every single person alive today who descends from those lineages. Not metaphorically. Genetically, literally, provably. Let's talk about what the genetic evidence tells us about specific ancient population events that shaped modern human diversity, because the recent explosion of ancient DNA research has made it possible to reconstruct the ancient human demographic story with a precision that was impossible even 20 years ago. One of the most striking findings from ancient DNA research concerns the specific demographic structure of ancient hunter-gatherer populations in different regions. Studies of ancient European hunter-gatherers spanning tens of thousands of years have found dramatic genetic discontinuities, periods where one genetic population essentially replaced another with minimal mixing. That documents specific events in ancient population history that had not previously been recognized. The ancient hunter-gatherers of Europe during the Ice Age were replaced, partially or substantially, by incoming populations from the Middle East associated with the spread of early farming approximately 9,000 to 8,000 years ago. Those early farmer populations were themselves partially replaced by incoming populations from the Eurasian steppe approximately 5,000 years ago. The modern European genetic profile is the result of these 3 major ancestral components: ancient hunter-gatherer, early farmer, and steppe pastoralist, mixed in proportions that vary across different European regions. Each of these population replacements involved specific ancient encounters, meetings between groups of people with different genetic backgrounds, different cultural practices, and different economic strategies that produced the mixed genetic descendants who are modern Europeans. The specific dynamics of these encounters, whether they involved conflict, intermarriage, gradual assimilation, or some combination, shaped the proportions in which the ancestral components were mixed and therefore the genetic character of modern European populations. Let me bring this back to the human scale of the story, because the most important thing about the journey from ancient encounters to 8 billion people is not the mathematics or the genetics. It is what those numbers represent. 8 billion people. Each one a unique individual with a specific inner life, specific relationships, specific experiences of joy and pain and loss and hope. Each one carrying in their genome the specific genetic contribution of the specific ancient people whose lineages threaded through hundreds of thousands of years of selection pressure to produce them. The ancient people whose encounters began this story. The specific individuals in Africa 300,000 years ago. The specific group who crossed out of Africa 60,000 years ago. The specific individuals who encountered Neanderthals in Western Asia and produced the mixed heritage children whose descendants eventually spread across the world, those people did not know what they were doing in any grand sense. They were doing what ancient humans did, finding food, staying warm, maintaining social relationships, raising children, surviving. The fact that their specific survival and reproductive success eventually produced 8 billion descendants is not something any of them could have predicted or planned for. But the chain they started is real. The genetic thread connecting their lives to every person alive today is real. You are, in the most literal biological sense, a consequence of specific ancient people making specific choices in specific ancient landscapes that no longer exist. The woman who crossed out of Africa with a small group of people is your ancestor. The man who survived the 117,000-year bottleneck when almost everyone else's lineage ended is your ancestor. The ancient people whose encounter in Africa 300,000 years ago produced the lineage that eventually became all of modern humanity are your ancestors. Not metaphorically, literally, genetically, provably. And you, carrying their genetics and their biology and the accumulated consequence of every encounter, every survival, every reproductive decision they ever made, you are what they were building toward without knowing it. 8 billion people. All of us, from that first meeting in an ancient African landscape that no one recorded and everyone descended from. That is the most extraordinary lineage story ever told, and it belongs to every single person alive.